Hello and welcome to the January 8th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. This is episode 99, which means the next episode will be episode 100. And I wanted to make that one the New Year's episode, so this will be a bit of a special feature. And for that, I'll be doing something a little bit more experimental. This will be the history episode. The history of Ukraine in as short of a time as I can fit it into. So, whatever the timestamp is, I don't know how long that will be, but we'll get there. I'm aiming for under an hour. Let's see. Now, history has been a rather important feature of this war and has been approached from many different directions. Quite a few Ukrainian media groups have done various reporting on elements of Ukrainian history, and I'd like to do some of that from my own perspective in the coming year. And of course, the Russian propaganda on this war is very, very tightly wrapped into historical narrative, with Vladimir Putin kind of famously in his interview with Tucker Carlson started off by talking about Yaroslav the Wise, the medieval Kiev ruler. Well, I'm going to go a little bit before that. Long before Yaroslav the Wise, into the ancient past. Don't take this as a statement of national identity or anything. Throughout the course of this episode, we'll be discussing how the Ukrainian national identity came to be over the course of time and the various elements that converged into it. So when I say I'm beginning in the Copper Age, don't take that to mean I'm saying that this is Ukrainians as we would know them today. But that long ancient history is interesting in its own way because it kind of presents a series of historical questions that have been answered by many people in, unfortunately, many ways. But first, some quick recommendations. If I was to recommend one history book on Ukraine, it would be The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine by Serhii Plokhy. That is the best general history. It has also had several editions, updating for facts as recent as the current war. And for videos, I would suggest the Timothy Snyder series on YouTube called The Making of Modern Ukraine. He's a very prominent professor, and it's a recording of his lectures. They're very good, and they'll cover, again, a broad general history of the country. So beginning in the about 5,000 to 3,000 BCE, we have something called the Trypillian culture. The Trypillian culture, they obviously didn't call themselves that. It's named after the village of Trypillia, which is not far south of the city of Kiev. It's a small village now, but back in the Copper Age, it was one of the largest settlements in the entirety of Europe, and part of a larger civilization that stretched from a little bit north of Kiev down into Romania. This Trypillian culture was very egalitarian. From the ruins that we are able to find, there's no clear evidence of social stratification. Everyone's house seems to be more or less the same, without some kind of royal palace in the center or anything like that. This was a farming community. It was very agricultural and is therefore one of the earliest large-scale agricultural urban civilizations, even before Mesopotamia. It's also where we see early proof of the existence of a wheel, though at the time it was mostly used for pottery, though the technological development of the wheel will be important in this later history. They also made advances in the fields of metallurgy, animal husbandry, and agriculture. And this civilization lasted until about the year 3000 BCE, when they were gradually overcome and replaced, and there are many possible explanations why, and honestly, talking about this far back in history, it's all very debatable, and one of the most contentious historical fields that I've ever tried to look into, so I'm not going to be making any presumptions as to which theory is correct or not, but through one way or another, eventually replaced by a different civilization known as the Yamnaya culture. The Yamnaya are especially important because they are one of the early Proto-Indo-European peoples, and these Proto-Indo-Europeans are the cultural ancestors of nearly everybody in Europe, with the exception of the Finns, Estonians, Hungarians, and Basques. Everyone else speaks a Indo-European language. This cultural world goes down into Iran and northern India. And the explanation of how this group spread from eastern Ukraine to Spain to India can be explained with the title of one of the better books on the topic, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language by David Anthony. So the horse, they might not have been the first to domesticate the horse, but were certainly an early adopter, possibly the second group. The wheel, like I said, the Trypillians did have wheels for pottery wheels, but the Yamnaya used it for chariots, which is a massive technological upgrade, which made them very, very good at war. And language. Like I said, all these groups speak a Proto-Indo-European language. And again, there are lots of possible theories of how this language spread. One classical explanation for it is through just outright conquest, but some genetic studies interpret it more in the face of the language of the Proto-Indo-Europeans became used as a trading language. They had the horse, so they dominated the horse trade, and was adopted by the elites of various cultures. So it might not have necessarily been outright conquest, as some may think of it, but also economic and cultural. And one of the largest sites for the Yamnaya is located near Mikhailivka in the Kherson region, right on the banks of the Dnipro River, currently the front line against the Russians in that area. And these Proto-Indo-Europeans, they're of course difficult to dig into historically, but that's kind of my point onto their importance politically. When we have the Yamnayas replacing the Trypillian culture, it has been understood in the historical record to basically be a more warlike, more hierarchical, more expansionist culture that worshipped a masculine sky god, taking over and replacing the more egalitarian farmer culture of the Trypillians. Once we reach the 9th century and people are studying archaeology and interpreting the past in their own ways, this went into very different directions of how to interpret this moment in history. On one hand, we have a lot of anarchist, feminist, left-leaning groups interpreting this conquest of the more egalitarian society as how there was some kind of more idyllic old Europe that was replaced by the violent sky worshippers thundering out of the steppes on their war chariots, peaceful and feminine being conquered by warlike and masculine, and that setting the tone for the rest of European history. Maybe there's some proof to it. Were the what-ifs there of if the Proto-Indo-Europeans never took over, if we never began worshipping the Proto-Indo-European gods, Deus Pater becoming Zeus and all the others, and were more peaceful farmers, which brings it to the other direction. And once I said Proto-Indo-European, you may be thinking of another name that they identified with, the Aryans. So you have a lot of groups, such as the Nazis, seeing the conquest of these Aryan peoples taking over Europe, deciding the fate of the world with their swords and their arrows, or probably spears. I don't know how great a sword would have been in that era, and how they have to continue the tradition of the conquering warrior, leading them to hunt down the other evidence of the old Indo-Europeans, going as far afield as India itself, reading through the ancient Vedas for proof of their ancient German heritage. Yeah, so two very different ways to look at this replacement, and definitely a topic I want to get into at another point, just as pretty much everything else in this episode. But moving on from there, the Indo-Europeans certainly did win, and for the next several centuries, several thousand years really, the lands of what would become Ukraine were dominated by a succession of various Indo-European speakers who, like their Yamna elders, were peoples of the steppe. And that is one of the themes that becomes very, very important, the steppe. Southern Ukraine is a part of the Pontic steppe, which goes from more or less the Caspian Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. And then the Pontic steppe is part of the larger Eurasian steppe, stretching all the way to China. And though there are some mountains and valleys in between, the dominant feature from here to there is a vast stretch of prairie land, largely similar to the prairies of the western US, and like the prairies of the western US and Canada, extremely fertile. So either through agriculture or through herding, these areas have historically been able to sustain large populations, though in this case they have largely been nomadic, living off of the horse, moving from place to place with seasonal pastures, and often being extremely successful and terrifying warriors. And the ones that enter into the historical record, meaning people actually wrote about them, not just archaeological evidence or anything like that. And by that, I usually mean the Greeks writing down these histories, is we fast forward to 1000 BCE with the Cimmerians. Now that name may stick out, as Conan the Barbarian was a Cimmerian, though in those stories they're presented as basically being the Proto-Irish, kind of getting into some of these weird 19th century racial theories of who comes from where. But the Cimmerians were the first in this next line of people who lived, like I said, steppe nomads, strong warriors, and shockingly populous for a non-urban culture. The Cimmerians were a part of the Scythian culture, and the Scythians came in and pushed them out later down the line. And then the Sarmatians. So the Cimmerians, the Scythians, and the Sarmatians cover the period from about 1000 BCE to about 400 AD or CE. And for my purposes here, I'm using BCE and CE, not BC and AD. If you read ancient histories, these peoples really do stand out as being very scary. The ancient Persians, who themselves, like I said, Indo-Europeans, very similar cultures, and the Scythians spoke an Iranic language. But if you're reading, for example, the histories of ancient Persia, famous Cyrus the Great led a campaign against the Scythians, where he was killed by the Scythian queen Tamrius, at which point she decapitated him and dipped his head in blood, representing him finally getting his fill of bloodlust. These were very grim people. They made drinking cups from the skulls of their enemies and were universally feared. However, that is possibly not true at all, and even the ancient sources think it could have been made up. There are many versions of the death of Cyrus the Great. But it gets the point across. But it's this encounter with the Greeks that I mentioned, the thing that brought the lands of Ukraine into history, is also where we get a lot of cultural mixing, which will remain relevant for the remainder of Ukrainian history up through today. You see, I mentioned that the lands of Ukraine were very fertile. There is something called black earth, chornozem, a type of soil which, as it's named, is extremely black in color due to its high percentages of organic matter, and is high in phosphorus, ammonia, and humus. And this soil makes farming very easy and very profitable, something that Ukraine will be famous for and will determine its fate in many ways up through, again, today. It is a consistent theme in Ukrainian history of other people wanting to exploit the very rich farmland of the Ukrainian areas. And the ancient Greeks certainly wanted the same. So we see Greek city-states being founded along the Black Sea coast, in Crimea, at Chersonosus and Theodosia, but also Tyrus, near what is now Odessa, and Olbia, near what is now Mykolaiv. And the purpose of these Greek city-states was to trade in grain. They are located at the mouths of Ukraine's great rivers, the Dnipro, the Dniester, etc. So the Scythians and the Sarmatians and the others could bring their grain into these Greek city-states, sell it to the Greeks, and have the Greeks then bring it back to kind of the Greek homeland and sell it there in a very, very prosperous Black Sea trade network. This Black Sea trade network was the inspiration for stories such as Jason and the Golden Fleece, where Jason went to what is now modern-day Georgia. Because at the time, the Greek city-states were growing very quickly, creating the urban civilization that became the root of what we now think of as Western civilization today. But to sustain a population growth of that size, you need food. And the food that they ate came from Ukraine and it came from Egypt. And so the first mention of the Ukrainian lands in history, and history means stuff that is written down. We consider prehistory to be the things that happened before people had writing to talk about it, was Herodotus in 430 BCE. And the first rule of all history podcasting is you have to mention Herodotus at some point, so here it is, where he mentioned a large Cimmerian city somewhere in southern Ukraine, often associated with the city of Mykolaiv, though very possibly not that at all. This is all very fuzzy. And that is the first mention, again, written down, of things happening in what is now Ukraine. And this Greek presence in Ukraine, which started, 3,000 years ago almost, continues to today. The Black Sea coast, up until, Stalin kind of changed that a lot, was very populated with a lot of Greeks. So Odessa used to be a very Greek city, and tragically, the largest Greek community in Ukraine was associated with Mariupol, the city that was destroyed by Russia, and I don't know how many Greeks are still living there. It was in Odessa that the original organization that strived for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, that's where they began, in Ukraine. But it was also, interestingly, twice over, the kind of end of a Greek culture. The Greek city-states that were functioning in Ukrainian lands were a part of the same political world as any other Greek city, got involved in the wars of those cities. So if we look at the very, very end of the height of the Greek world before it is replaced by the Roman one of the last holdouts was the Bosporan Kingdom, which was centered in Crimea, before being crushed by Pompey the Great in the Mithridatic Wars. And then, with the fall of the Byzantine Roman Empire, the very last holdout of the empire clinging to life, keeping that old world alive, was again in Crimea. So twice over, the Greeks were killed, and then they were also reborn in the land of Ukraine. And as Greeks and Sarmatians and Scythians were living side by side together, they formed a kind of synthetic culture with each other. A lot of the people living in Crimea in the last centuries before the birth of Christ were essentially Scythians who learned to speak Greek. But then, as we get into about the same time as the end of the Roman Empire, 500, two groups emerge at the edge of this Greek/Iranian-speaking world and eventually take over large parts of it. These are the Turks and the Slavs. The Turks came from farther east in the Eurasian steppe, speaking a non-Indo-European language. Turkic is separate from the Indo-Europeans, and kind of took over a lot of this formerly Indo-European speaking steppe area. So nowadays, this is now a territory associated with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tatarstan, Turkic speaking areas. And this is when they kind of become Turkic, about the year 500. And in Ukraine, we see two Turkish groups taking over in succession for each other. First, the Bulgars, who would later go on to take over Bulgaria, and the Khazars. And the Khazars are an interesting one that you've probably heard of more through deranged Nazi conspiracy theories on the internet, more so than the historical record. So here's why. The Khazars were a Turkic-speaking steppe nomadic group. Though they would speak a separate language from the Scythians or Sarmatians, their lifestyle was basically still the same. The great horse lords of the steppe, they kind of optimized how that lifestyle worked out. You didn't need too many improvements, except for some technological evolution throughout the years. But the Khazar leaders, and it's possible it could have just been the leaders, it's possible it could have been deeper into society, at some point converted to Judaism, leading to the conspiracy theories that exist now of how all Jews are actually secret Tatars and not actually from the land of Israel. Now, that is all nonsense. The Khazar culture largely disappeared within a few centuries of this, and Jewish migration in Europe tends to go from west to east, not east to west, so explain how that fits into the theories. But it is from the Khazars that are kind of the last of the steppe peoples to rule over the place before the rise of the Slavs. And the Slavic people were the people who kind of were hiding away from all those scary steppe warriors for hundreds of years. They lived in the forests and hills and swamps and riverlands of what especially make up the territory in between what is now Ukraine and Belarus. And then getting into the western parts of Ukraine that are more hilly and more mountainous. And in all this land, it's harder for your horse riding steppe nomads to rule over as effectively, leaving the early Slavic, Proto-Slavic people to develop a bit more separately from their southern neighbors. However, they are very much in connection with the Scythian cultures to the south of them. Herodotus categorized them as the farming Scythians that the royal Scythians ruled over. So that is the milieu that they're developing in. But then one of the early, truly Slavic cultures that we see develop is the Kyiv culture. From the name, you can guess that in the area of Kyiv is where this happened. And this was in the early 1st centuries BC. So kind of simultaneously with the era of the Roman Empire. Their culture was very based around the worship of nature, though they were still Indo-European. So like other Indo-Europeans, they did have a sky god ruling over all the others. In the case of the Greeks, it would be Zeus. In the case of the Slavs, it would be Perun. But they had various sacred trees. They carved totems. In their urban settlements tended to be hill forts that were built on the hilly areas in the turn of rivers. So very, very defensible positions that they would put these hill forts in to both defend themselves and have trade and such. And if you come to Kyiv today, you can very much see what they had in mind here. Looking out across the Dnipro River now to the older parts of the city, it is a hill fort built on a river bend, easily defensible and ideal for trade. You can very visually see it, but these Slavic culture gradually over the course of centuries spread further and further to the point of at the end of the Roman Empire, they were talking about a group called the Veneti, a group of Slavs who lived in what's now northern Poland, northern Germany, on the Baltic Sea, who were basically Slavic Vikings known for raiding across waters in their boats, leaving parts of Scandinavia barren of villagers fleeing before their wrath. So, of course, they would be the first that other people would run into. But as we get to the end of the Roman Empire, we see the migration period. Those of us with backgrounds from more the Western European side of things know that this is where the Saxons came to what's now England, the Franks to what's now France. A lot of these people were pushed westward, actually, by Attila the Hun, but Slavs were also a part of this migration period. So starting out in their homeland of what's now Western Ukraine into Belarus, they spread throughout Eastern Europe, down into the Balkans, to the point where there was a Slavic language that could be spoken anywhere from Greece up to what's now St. Petersburg. Though over time, these various Slavic groups would diverge into the Eastern Slavs, the people who are now Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians, the Western Slavs, the people who are now Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks, and Sorbians, and some other groups, and the Southern Slavs, the Serbians, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Bulgarians, and Macedonians. So that is at the time of the end of the Roman Empire, around the year 500, into what we think of as the early Middle Ages. And here is where we begin to catch up with something that is more resembling of a Ukraine. That is medieval Kyiv. Most of this information will come from the Tale of Bygone Years, or the Primary Chronicle. Medieval histories, primary sources, tend to be in the form of these chronicles that are largely propagandistic. So we do know what they say. We can often tie them into real historical events. However, chronicles tend to be written several centuries after the fact and done to promote whatever ruling dynasty paid for that chronicle. So I will not be problematizing medieval Ukrainian history in this way. There are a lot of alternative theories here. For example, there is a lot of archaeological proof that point to the Khazars being influential in Kyiv much later than the primary chronicles said they were, but I'll just stick to the story for now, leave it for later episodes. So this story that's in part of the primary chronicle goes as such. There is a bunch of Slavic, Finnic, and other tribes who want to have a king to rule over them, and who they invite is a Viking named Rurik. This is the height of the Viking Age. The Viking raids are going from Ireland to Iceland to the Americas in the west, and in the east, establishing trade networks with the Byzantine Romans, the Muslims. This is the Viking Age. And so they invite a Viking, though there's probably already Viking rulers at the time Rurik came in. There's already a Viking ruler in Kyiv, but Rurik takes over in Novgorod, in what is now northern Russia, close to the border with Finland, and then sets out to expand his dynasty southwards over what's now Kyiv, and the descendants of Rurik make Kyiv the center of what is now referred to as Kyivan Rus. Kyivan Rus was important to these Vikings, or most of them Swedes and Finns, because it was something of a middle point in the trade route that went from Scandinavia down to Constantinople. So you would get in a boat, take that boat out the Daugava River in what's now Latvia as far as you could, take that boat out of the water, take it over to the Dnipro River, and sail it down to the Black Sea, getting out a few times where the waters get too rough, eventually heading to Constantinople, now Istanbul, to sell your stuff. That stuff being honey, that stuff being furs, that stuff being people. A lot of the slave trade going down this route. And the early form of Kyivan Rus was mostly that. These Scandinavian rulers ruling over a group of people who were otherwise foreign to them and doing a lot of raiding for slaves and other goods. But within just a few short generations, these Varangians, as they were called, began to adopt more of the Slavic culture of the people they were ruling over. So at first we have our Valdemars and our Helgis, and then later we get our Sviatoslavs. And it is Sviatoslav the Brave, who had by this time adopted Slavic culture and religion and speech, who really turned Kyivan Rus from a trade hub to an empire. He raided the city of Constantinople itself. He expanded his territory southward into the steppe, and at this time the southern part of Ukraine was still dominated by Turkic-speaking groups, the ones I was talking about, these steppe peoples. And he is ultimately the one who defeated the Khazar Khanate, burned down their capital, and broke Turkish rule over Ukraine, except for, again, the very south of it. That would come and go as power waned and went over time. Another important ruler that came up later was Volodymyr, and was under Volodymyr the Great that the Slavic people of Kyivan Rus became Christianized through their extensive connections with the Byzantine Romans. There had already been some spread of Christianity earlier, but Volodymyr came to a realization in that this was now a world dominated by Christianity and Islam, and he had to pick a side. Paganism was slowly fading away before the force of these two evangelizing faiths. And so, again, turning back to the tale of bygone years, just going to stick with the traditional telling of history right now, though probably not true, is that Volodymyr had to weigh his options. Now he went to the Jews. Would Kyivan Rus be Jewish? And, well, no, the Jews lost their homeland, and therefore God cannot favor them. So they're right out. The Muslims, that's a good one. There's some very powerful Muslim empires in the area, such as the Bulgars. The caliphates are doing a good job in the Middle East at this time. They're doing pretty good. But they don't drink alcohol, and they don't eat pork. And alcohol is the joy of the Rus, and therefore cannot give up your booze and your pork. Leaving Christianity. And Volodymyr is said to have seen the great Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, felt as though he was walking to heaven itself, and realized that it wasn't quite Orthodox Christianity yet, the schism hadn't happened, that Christianity was the religion for him, particularly of the Greek variety. The Western Christianity, at the time, a bit too poor for his taste. And through Christianity, we also get language, or written language, I should say. The Cyrillic alphabet, which is still used for Ukrainian, was developed for a language called Old Church Slavonic that was used to bring Christianity to Bulgaria in the generations prior. And so Cyrillic became the writing system, and Old Church Slavonic became the fancy language that you would speak in the halls of government and what you would write down important histories in, though it wasn't necessarily the language that people actually spoke. And then the next great ruler I'll talk about in the era of Kyivan Rus was Yaroslav the Wise. Good old Yaroslav the Wise that Putin went on his rant about. He was the great lawgiver of Kyivan Rus. He wrote the Russkaya Pravda, the legal code that Rus would be governed by. He built the Lavra in Kiev, the great monastery that became the center for Eastern Slavic Christianity. He built St. Sophia's Cathedral, which is still seen in downtown Kiev, though heavily remodeled over time, of course. And he defeated the Pechengs, the Turkic group that had been harassing the southern borders of Kyivan Rus from their homes in the southern Ukrainian steppe. This was the very height of power of Kyivan Rus. But with the death of Yaroslav the Wise in the year 1054, things began to fracture. Now, Kyivan Rus was never a singular unified area. It was far too big for that. Kyivan Rus stretched from its heights from about what's now Odessa up to about what's now St. Petersburg. That's a large territory that in the Middle Ages was a bit ungovernable anyway. But as Yaroslav the Wise and his centralization of power went away, the family, this Rurik family, all descendants of Rurik, began to sort into a bunch of smaller principalities that were all actually independent of each other, while still being part of a kind of common Kyivan Rus system. And the most important of these principalities are the ones that I think are the most interesting politically and historically, especially looking today. And that is the Kingdom of Galicia, centered around what's now Western Ukraine, Lviv, that area, Lviv being built by Danilo, one of the kings of Galicia, was more reminiscent of what you would see in Western Europe. The feudal system, very similar to Central European feudalism. It was a part of the common cultural world of Poland, of Hungary, of even into the German Holy Roman Empire at the time. That was the world that they were keyed into. It was a series of feudal lords answerable to the king. Again, those of us that grew up in the Western tradition, you get it. The Republic of Novgorod in what's now northern Russia on the Baltic Sea and the White Sea was something of an early merchant democracy, the kind that you would see in, for example, Renaissance Italy. You had your noble families, and that they would vote on who their rulers would be, and there was this idea of Great Novgorod, who they would be loyal to. If we look at modern Russian liberals, if you've seen the blue and white flag, they're referring to the Republic of Novgorod. They see Novgorod as basically being a Russia that could have been a early democracy that, if it continued to develop as a democracy, would mean that Russia of today would be different. Though to problematize that actual power in Novgorod was often influenced by this next one, Grand Principality of Vladimir Suzdal, and other outside forces. And though they can look to the historic feature of Novgorod, they were kind of part of the Baltic trade routes that was connected to what's now Germany, the Hanseatic League. They also looked eastwards, and their push eastward into the Ural Mountain areas, especially to expand their control over the fur trade, kind of became the precursor to Russia eventually conquering Siberia in the future. And then the third one, the Grand Principality of Vladimir Suzdal, offered another path forward, which is the one that Russia has been on ever since. A lot of people attribute Russian autocracy to the Mongols, which will be our next topic, but really it comes to Vladimir Suzdal. Unlike some of the others that came out of Rus, the Prince of Vladimir Suzdal was much more autocratic. People were much more directly answerable to him. Power came from the autocrat himself, not necessarily the political competition of a republic like in Novgorod or the feudalism of Galicia, but just the autocrat of Vladimir Suzdal. And they would quickly whittle away at the proto-democratic features that were in Slavic culture. And one city within this territory that would eventually inherit the rest of it was Moscow. Dun dun dun, villain reveal. So for this next couple of centuries, this next about 200 years or so, these various Kyivan Rus principalities and republics would compete against each other. Whoever would hold Kiev would kind of hold the title of Prince of Kiev and therefore kind of the one in charge of the rest of them, but not really. Kiev still held a lot of cultural importance. It still held a lot of religious importance, but it didn't hold the same amount of political military importance that it had under Yaroslav. Though in the Ukrainian telling of history, last people to hold the Principality of Kiev before it all went dark was Galicia, and therefore Galicia was the inheritor of Kyivan Rus as a whole. But then in 1223 came the last of the great steppe cultures to conquer the weak and divided settled peoples to their south and west. And that's the Mongols. The Mongol horde had already conquered much of China at this point, secured all of Central Asia and united its various nomadic peoples, and then stretched into Kyivan Rus. This first battle, like I said, was in 1223, though the big one was in 1240, when the Mongol general Subutai destroyed Kiev, killing most of its people, destroying its churches, and laying waste to the countryside, breaking the power of Kyivan Rus. And for the next several centuries was the process of various other peoples pushing the Mongols out. Though this wasn't quite as apocalyptic as later histories would make it out to be, many of the Rus principalities remained, though just became vassals to the Mongol hordes. But as time goes on, the Mongols began to break apart more and more, with the first big change with the Mongols who controlled what's now Ukraine, southern Russia, and into Kazakhstan becoming the Golden Horde, as opposed to other hordes in different locations, such as the Ilkhanate in Persia. They converted to Islam, which became very important because the Golden Horde did not appreciate it when other Mongols were destroying the major centers of Islamic culture in Baghdad, leading to conflicts between the Golden Horde and the Ilkhans that did that. But from there, fracturing more and more and more as the centuries turned on. And this is a bit of a fast forward, but one of them is the Crimean Khanate. One of the descendants of Genghis Khan brought his retinue to Crimea, turned it into his headquarters, his ulus, his horde, and the various Turkic groups, Greek-speaking groups, and basically everyone who lived on the Crimean Peninsula to that point began to merge into the Crimean Tatar people, most of them locals who had been there for a long time, Greeks, Goths, Haji Garay, the descendant of Genghis Khan, who ruled over them. So often the Crimean Tatars are called, people who are foreign invaders and all that, but no, they were mostly local Greeks, previous Turkic-speaking groups, Goths, ruled by this Garay family. So it's really only the Garays who are too far afield. But as these other Mongol holdings fade away, we get our next main character here, which is Lithuania and Poland. So Poland moves in and takes Lviv and a lot of what we now call Western Ukraine in this time period, while Lithuania, who today we think of as a fairly small country, but at the time they were the great power player in Eastern Europe. They were still pagan, for one. They had not converted to Christianity for another few centuries at this point. But the Lithuanians pushed further and further south, taking over much of what we would call Belarus. They made alliances with the nobility of former Kyivan Rus to the point where Slavic-speaking people, Rus people, outnumbered the Lithuanians themselves. So the Old Church Slavonic was used as the court language. There's a lot of protections given for the autonomy of these Slavic peoples, and this is where we kind of see later on how the identities that make up modern-day Belarus and Lithuania are very closely intertwined. But the date that's important here is the year 1362, where the Lithuanians and their Slavic allies defeated the Mongols at what's called the Battle of Blue Waters. Closest modern city to it is Uman, and this established Lithuania stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and most of the core territory of what used to be Kyivan Rus under Lithuania. And like I said, the Old Rus nobility was quite important in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, though again that declined over time. The relationship that Lithuania and Poland had together was one of common enemies. So now that Lithuania was the main power, they were threatened by early Muscovy to the east, Russia beta version. But then there was the Germans and the Crusaders, because, like I said, at this time, Lithuania was still pagan. So German Crusaders of the Teutonic Order saw it as their Christian duty to conquer the lands of Lithuania, subjugate and enslave its people, convert them to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the very profitable amber trade was just a nice gem on top of it all. So with this threat of Moscow to the east and the Germans to the west and north, Poland and Lithuania began a process of going closer and closer together. And so in the year 1385, in the Union of Krevo, it was decided that Poland and Lithuania would have a common monarch. So it would be two countries, two sets of political systems, but one duke in between Jogaila and Jadwiga of the Jagiello dynasty. And this relationship with Poland meant that their relationship with we'll call them Ruthenians now, these Rus peoples who lived in the territory of what's now Belarus and Ukraine. In the historical record, they take the Latin name Ruthenians, so we'll just call them Ruthenians at this point. The Poles become more important, making the Ruthenians less important. And under this arrangement, we eventually get the year 1508, a bit of a fast forward again, where we get our first time of Moscow taking Ukrainian lands, where there's rebellion around the city of Chernihiv that allows Moscow to take over. But that is now our setting for the beginning of what's called early modernity. So moving out of the Middle Ages into the early modern period. So around the year 1500, this happens. So let's put it this way. Americans, 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. That is kind of the fracture point between the medieval period and the early modern period. So let's just go with that, the year 1500. In the area of what's now Ukraine, we now have Poland and Lithuania, who are growing ever closer together until eventually just becoming one country, and that is the largest power in Eastern Europe. But to their east, they have the growing power of Muscovy that is taking over more and more territory and consolidating the former parts of Kyivan Rus that were into their northeast. We have the Crimean Tatars to the south, this post-Mongol, Turkic-speaking, syncretic cultures of the Crimean Peninsula, who carry on the best traditions of the steppe. They are still horse raiders, though they are growing closer to the Ottoman Empire, so as time goes on, we equate the Crimean Tatar Khanate more and more with the Ottoman Empire. And even within the Ottoman Empire, the leader of the Crimean Tatars was considered kind of the second guy, the vice president, the number two behind the Sultan, because the bloodline of Genghis Khan made him that important, though that would later go away. And to the west, the Holy Roman Empire and the Germans. But in the middle of all this, we still have our Ruthenians, our Proto-Ukrainians, living on the territory of what would become Ukraine. And this is where we begin to see the formation of a new group of people called the Cossacks. Now, in the medieval times and before, there was always this culture of people living on the borders between the more urban areas of the north and the southern steppe, that was still largely dominated by Turkic-speaking steppe nomads. There had always been raids, there had always been war. And so to form a border security force, the various Rus nobility, Lithuanians, would hire out often other Turks to be a mercenary force to kind of patrol around and stop raiding from happening into their own lands. But as time went on, and the nobility of Poland became more and more powerful, and Lithuania was becoming more and more Polonized and taking notes from that, a lot of these peasants did not like having these increased burdens put upon them, so they ran away. They ran away to this border territory and joined the Cossacks. They had become a warrior society, always having to be alert for when the next raid would happen. They adopted many Turkic customs. So if we think of the kind of Cossack haircut that is popular among some in Ukraine right now, they kind of shave the sides of the head, leave a crest on top, then let it grow long. That was originally a Turkic haircut, some Turkic weapons, a lot of Turkish vocabulary, Turkic fighting of war. They became Slavic steppe nomads themselves. And this class of Slavic steppe nomads came to become one of the most important parts of the military of Poland and Lithuania. Though before I get further into detail on that, I do have to make another note here, which is that in a lot of tellings of this history, southern Ukraine, the wild fields, are treated as a kind of no man's land, where nobody can live because it's so dangerous. But that wasn't true. There was this culture that developed in this area that was able to become unique on its own because it was so dangerous. They were further away from the centers of power. They were further away from the nobles and the taxman who could tell them what to do, beginning this very free-spirited type culture, this kind of culture that rejected outside leadership, outside control. These Cossacks were not just soldiers. They were also farmers. Some of them were kind of these semi-nomadic peoples moving from different parts of southern Ukraine to raise bees. That's kind of silly to say, but honey was a major export of this area. To have these groups of wandering traders called chumaks who went to the very salty salt lakes next to Crimea to gather that salt, sell it in Western Europe for a very high price. There was absolutely a culture here. It was just a culture that doesn't line up to our vision of history and our vision of society that is very much tied to strong state control. They just didn't have it. They're on their own. And the reason it was on their own is because they are in this dangerous area where they had to look out for themselves. And this formed very hard men who were often quite violent themselves, who formed their own prejudices, which would become a problem later on. But there's almost something kind of American to all that I think a lot of our listeners can appreciate and identify with. They were cowboys, though cowboys on their own land, not expanding into places they had not already lived. And they're also a pretty literate society. These were free peasants, but especially as time goes on, more and more of them would send their kids to school. Pretty much everyone that was a part of this Cossack kind of officer class would send their kids to be schooled in Kyiv. And of course, this came at the cost of offering their services as soldiers. They lived hard, they knew how to fight better than anyone else, so that's what they had to offer. Probably the most famous of these Cossack leaders of this time period was Kosh Ataman Petro Sahedachny, who is currently the patron saint of the Ukrainian armed forces. Sahedachny waged campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. He raided Istanbul itself, a daring naval raid against the Ottomans at the very height of their powers. He attacked the Crimean city of Kaffa and freed the many slaves who were held there before being sold off into the Ottoman Empire and beyond. And he agreed to take part in a campaign against Moscow. Moscow at this time was weak. Poland wanted its throne, and the Poles needed the Cossacks to go after him, allowing Sahedachny to lay siege to the city of Moscow itself and its surrounding forts. They did not conquer Moscow, but they did secure many territories, assurances, though what use is a Muscovite's assurances. And in exchange for this partial victory, the Cossacks were granted more rights. This Zaporizhian Sich, this area beyond the rapids, about halfway down the Dnipro River, you start to run into more rapids, which makes transport harder. The Zaporizhians lived beyond those rapids, hence the name, and the Sich became, at least officially, more independent of the Polish and Lithuanian authorities. Again, 1619. And a lot of the history between the Cossacks and the Poles especially is about this balance of how many rights the Cossacks are able to secure, the Poles trying to retract those rights and running into conflict and wars and rebellions to strike the middle point between those two positions. And the Cossacks would also leverage their position as this very strategic group of people to play their various enemies off of each other. And with that, we get into the period of the Great Cossack Uprisings and eventually the loss of Polish control entirely over this area. So as Poland is expanding, the Poland and Lithuania are coming closer together. The Polish nobility becomes more and more powerful. They secure more and more rights for themselves, and they form a kind of noble republic where the king is elected, and every individual member of the Polish noble class had an ironclad series of rights that the king could not violate. They had their golden liberties, that when there was a vote, all it would take is one person to veto. It had to be full consensus, or a single person could vote no and scuttle the whole deal. Though in actuality, what it came down to is if someone might have voted no, his fellow nobles might have taken him out back and persuaded him otherwise, but in theory, they had this veto. They also raised themselves up as a superior class of people. They had this idea of Sarmatianism. So you remember the Sarmatians from earlier on in the episode? The Polish nobility saw themselves as descendants of these Sarmatians, while the people they ruled over as an inferior class that their Sarmatian ancestors conquered. And as that relates to Ukraine, is that Polishness became an important cultural determiner of how much power you could have. So a lot of these former Ruthenian nobles took on Polish culture. They adopted the Catholic religion as opposed to Orthodox Christianity, and they became Polish. Leaving the Ruthenians, the Ukrainians, without their own ruling class. And into that power vacuum came the Cossacks again. And this transition over of Polish domination over these Proto-Ukrainians came in the form of three separate events. So the first was in 1569, the Union of Lublin. This merged Poland and Lithuania into a single country, the Rzeczpospolita, the Republic, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland and Lithuania became a single country. Though still divided into the Kingdom of Poland and the Duchy of Lithuania, a part of this Union of Lublin meant that all of what is now modern Ukraine was transitioned over to the Kingdom of Poland. So before it was the Ukrainian lands were divided between the two, now all of them became Poland. And this is why they are Ukrainian lands. The Ruthenian people were divided at this time between what is now Belarus, was a part of Lithuania, and what is now Ukraine became a part of Poland. And because of the different traditions of those two areas, the Belarusian and Ukrainian people diverged from each other. So this is the point where I'm going to start using the word Ukrainian. And with that, the Kingdom of Poland, which its much more powerful nobility, took over the Ukrainian lands from the more light touch of the Lithuanians. And so these high-level Polish nobles, the magnates, took more and more Ukrainian lands for themselves and turned them into essentially plantations. These vast estates that beforehand had been smaller holdings of Ukrainian peoples were turned into these huge estates of these big Polish noble families, turning more and more peasants into serfs, peasants who are attached to the land and aren't allowed to leave it. Not slaves, but, not slaves, causing more of them to seek freedom among the Cossacks. The next thing to happen was in 1595, the Union of Brest. This happened after the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks. And when that happened, the Orthodox Christian religion was in a real problematic spot. They did not have the wealth and prestige of the Byzantine Roman Empire anymore, and they kind of had to figure out what to do. In 1453, the Turks take Constantinople. Over a century later, 1595, the Poles have an idea. They tell the Ukrainians, look, you can keep your traditions. You can keep your method of prayer. You can keep most things that make Orthodox Christianity local to you. However, you now have to listen to the Pope, and a lot of Ukrainian clergy agreed. This is the beginning of what's now called the Greek Catholic Church of Ukraine, very prominent in the west of the country, with a closer connection to Poland, obviously. But this kind of opened up the wounds to create a religious conflict. The Poles were trying to turn the Ukrainians into Catholics, and the Ukrainians saw Orthodox Christianity as a key part of their identity and were not about to allow that to happen lightly. And then 1638, because of those previous two problems, there had been a lot of Cossack uprisings. And in order to put down those uprisings in 1638, the Poles decided to put in an ordinance that abolished the rights of the Cossack class, and this pissed them off. So now we see a series of fissures that open up between the Poles and the Ukrainians. On one hand, we have a kind of proto-national problem. The Poles rule over the Ukrainians. Next, we have a cultural level of a lot of the Ukrainian nobility becoming Polish and leaving the rest of their people behind. We have an economic conflict. The Polish nobility are increasingly taking away the rights and making life more difficult for the peasantry. And we have a religious conflict between Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism. And all of these many conflicts came to a head with our next chapter, the Khmelnytsky Rebellion. Bogdan Khmelnytsky was a Ukrainian noble whose ancestors won a lot of glory serving the Polish crown. He went to a Jesuit Catholic school, though he maintained his Orthodox faith while doing so, something many of his peers did not do. And he then had a long-standing feud with another noble named Danilo Chaplinski, and at this time, like I said, there is not so much government control over a lot of the Ukrainian lands, and therefore raiding each other was a common activity of the nobility. And in one of these raids, Chaplinski killed Khmelnytsky's son, and later on, Khmelnytsky would marry Danilo's wife. They had bad blood between each other, but as Danilo took all of Khmelnytsky's land, he tried to appeal to the Polish courts about this, tried to appeal to the king to get them to have his lands back that were promised to him and were stolen, and he was met with no, no, and no. And so he ran off to join the Cossacks. He was already an important figure, like through his family line even, amongst the Cossacks. He had his own Cossacks who were loyal to him. But he went down to the Zaporizhian Sich, this Sich meaning fortification, this place where the Cossacks really ruled over things, and got their help, thus beginning the Khmelnytsky Rebellion, probably the most important event in modern Ukrainian history. And these Cossacks, for all the reasons I just described, were more than ripe to have a rebellion against the Poles. They wanted to get their rights back. They wanted to protect their religion. They wanted to not be told what to do by the Polish nobles anymore. Initially, this was not an independence war or anything like that, though it eventually became one. They destroyed the fortifications that were put in place to prevent peasants from going to the Cossacks, burned many Polish estates, captured Kiev, and from a Jewish perspective, they killed a lot of Jews. The Jews, I'm not talking much about Jewish history during all this times, but I could always make notes of where the Jews come in. But this is a simplified history that is mostly political and militaristic in nature, not cultural or anything like that, which is where Jews come in. But the Jews at this point were very attached to the Polish nobility. They gained their rights directly from the Polish crown. So in addition to standard medieval anti-Semitism, there's also the many layers of conflicts that they may have had with the Poles that transferred themselves onto the Jews, leading to one of the largest massacres of Jewish people up to that point, and became actually a fasting day to mourn the Jews killed in the Khmelnytsky uprising. But that's one layer of that war, which I would like to delve into at a later date, but moving on. During this uprising, the Cossacks are able to secure much of what we now think of as Ukraine and ruled over it as the Hetmanate, the Hetman being the leader of the Cossacks. They also allied themselves with the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Tatars are more than happy to take an opportunity to make Poland weaker and gladly ally themselves with the Cossacks in order to fight the war to make that happen. A lot happened with that war. Fast forwarding over all of it, it ends with something called the Pereyaslav Agreements. The Cossacks are in a tight spot, and then in 1654, this rebellion began in 1647. In 1654, the military situation is difficult, and in order to secure a Cossack victory, the Cossacks align themselves with Moscow. And here's where it begins. The Ukrainian national anthem is based on a poem. Not all of it is within the song itself. But further down in the poem, you get the lines, "O Bogdan, Bogdan, our great hetman, for what did you give Ukraine to wretched Muscovites? To return her honor, we lay our heads. We shall call ourselves Ukraine's faithful sons." So the terms of this alliance were misunderstood by the two sides. To the Cossacks, who were raised in an environment of politics being a series of negotiated rights, often negotiated at the tip of a sword, a series of relationships and agreements, they thought that they were doing the same with Moscow, that there would be a mutual agreement between the two sides, and that if one broke those agreements, they broke the entire pact. That is not how Moscow saw things. They saw the Pereyaslav Agreements as submission of Cossacks joining what would become the Russian Empire, now still Muscovy. And this fundamental disagreement is what leads eventually to the loss of Ukrainian independence and submission to Moscow. And with all those other interpretations, this rebellion that I already gave, the religious, the economic, we now add the Russian nationalist. Russians like Khmelnytsky, because this, the beginning of the friendship of nations, when the great Russians and the little Russians were finally joined together in one, and not something that Ukrainians grew to appreciate over time. The period in time in Ukrainian history after the death of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in the year 1657, so again, Pereyaslav Agreements, 1654, not long after that, Khmelnytsky dies, and we have the Ruin. The Ruin is a series of political disagreements over who is going to be in charge of the Cossack Hetmanate. It's a series of warfare. Lots of blood is shed, a lot of agreements are made and broken. And it's during this time of the Ruin, where the Cossacks are weak and vulnerable, that we have the Treaty of Andrusovo, where the Cossacks thought that they were fighting for their independence and alliance with Moscow, ends with Moscow making a deal over their heads to split Ukraine along the Dnipro River, with everything to the east of it going to Russia, and everything to the west of it going to Poland, and Kyiv in the middle going to Russia. And so we begin the period of Russian occupation. Though, interestingly, it was during this time that allowed Russia to become Russia. Moscow was pretty backwards by European standards. They had 0 universities on their territory. They had nothing of an intelligentsia, and without intelligentsia, you don't have ideology. And as Russia takes control over Kyiv, though, again, this is still controlled by the Cossacks, but in vassalage to Moscow. Moscow is now the lord of the Cossacks. The Cossacks are the ones on the ground. When Russia takes Kyiv, they take the Kyiv Academy, what is now the Kyiv Mohyla University. And that is when the idea of a Russian Empire comes into play. It is the Orthodox priests who study at the Kyiv Academy who develop the idea of a common East Slavic Rus people under the Muscovite control, partially because this is what allows them to become more powerful within the growing empire themselves. I mean, they come up with the idea for the empire, kind of gives you a good spot to be. And so this intelligentsia leaks out of Kyiv into the future Russia, and it is not long after, and it's within the next generation, that the Russian Empire itself is declared with the explicit goal of uniting the three Rus people, the Great Russians, Russia, the Little Russians, Ukraine, and the White Russians, Belarus. This whole problem could have been solved if nobody went to school. But this period of the ruin ends in the year 1687 with a more stable Cossack hetmanate government on the east of Ukraine that is loyal to Russia, and then another set of arrangements with the Cossacks in Poland, though I'll get to that later, on the western bank of the Dnipro, which leads us to our next great historical figure, Mazepa. Ivan Mazepa was originally a Cossack general under Emperor Peter. You may know him as Peter the Great, but I do not refer to Russian rulers as great. He is Peter the First to me. So under Peter the First, he takes part in the various wars to expand the Russian Empire of the time. And of course, while not fighting wars, he is also known as a great cultural figure. He promotes the Cossack Baroque period. A lot of the old buildings in Kiev, the kind of typical Kiev look, comes from the Mazepa area with this Cossack Baroque architecture. Patron of the arts, all that stuff. But as a military figure, he eventually comes to switch sides because on one hand, he, like any Cossack leader, remembers his ancient rights, which he would like to have back. And also, the Cossacks were really abused by Peter. In the building of the city of St. Petersburg, many thousands of Ukrainian Cossacks were killed. Some say that the city was built on the bones of the Cossacks, leading to some bad blood between him and his emperor. And so, in the Great Northern War between Russia and Sweden, Mazepa switches sides. He fights for Sweden, which at the time was a very important power. We don't think of it as a military power today. Trust me, at the time, it was a big deal. And fights along the Swedes at the Battle of Poltava, a battle that the Swedes and the Cossacks lose, causing Mazepa's faction to have to flee Ukraine for the Ottoman Empire, Moldova, and into the rest of Europe that comes next. Mazepa is considered the arch traitor by the Russians. The Russian Orthodox Church places an anathema on his name. They curse him, even up till today. And in the future, any Ukrainian who has thoughts of independence or national identity is called a Mazepist. Though as a modern note, you may have been watching the latest fight between Alexander Usyk and Tyson Fury for the heavyweight championship that Usyk had already won and Fury was challenging. Boxing I'm talking about, by the way, in case you didn't see it. And at the end of the fight, after Usyk wins, he holds a sword in the air, and it's the sword of Hetman Mazepa, the signifier of Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian independence. But they have to flee, though with Mazepa's retinue leaving Ukraine, another important step in the creation of the Ukrainian state happens. One of his generals is Prylip Orlik, and Prylip Orlik writes a constitution, arguably, and Ukrainians will certainly say so, but arguably, the first written constitution in Europe, the Prylip Orlik Constitution of the year 1710. Now, at the time it was written, they didn't actually control all that much. It was written in exile, but it shows the beginning of a modern state identity for Ukraine. Not just a series of agreements and arrangements and rights and privileges with a different ruling class, but a government, a modern government for Ukraine. Prylip Orlik died in exile. But throughout the 1700s, the rights of the Cossacks of a class are eroded more and more. Though the time was also the creation of Sloboda Ukraina, the area around modern Kharkiv, mostly settled by Ukrainians from the Poltava region. But now we have basically 3 Ukrainian territories under the control of Russia, the area around Kiev, the Hetmanate, to the south, Zaporizhia, and now Sloboda Ukraina. But over time, they have more Russian nobles put in charge of them. The register of allowable Cossacks decreased until eventually we hit Catherine II. Again, not calling her Catherine the Great. Catherine II, Empress of Russia. Catherine is another interesting figure in Russian history. Like Peter, She was a modernizer. She looked to Europe. Peter, when he was looking to Europe, he was looking at a lot of technological changes, created the Russian Navy, for example. Catherine was raised on European philosophy. This was the era of the Enlightenment. And in America, we mostly associate the Enlightenment with the growth of democracy, but that wasn't all. The other strain of thought that happened in the Enlightenment was something called enlightened despotism. This was typified by Louis XIV of France, who reigned from 1643 to 1715, and then Frederick the Great of Prussia, 1740 to 1786. And it was through this model they believed that the state had to be embodied by the monarch, that the medieval arrangements where various castes and towns and levels and nobility would have a series of arrangements with each other that determined their place in the state, what they did, what they were allowed, that had to go away to create a unified state under a single absolute monarch. And to Catherine, one of those medieval arrangements was the Cossacks. And so in the year 1775, she liquidated the Zaporizhian Siege. She destroyed the rights of the Cossacks. No more would there be a semi-independent series of Cossack polities in what's now modern Ukraine, but instead just Russian territories with Russian nobility, with Russian laws, with a Russian army. Meanwhile, 1783, she concludes the conquest of Crimea, destroying the Crimean Khanate. And in 1772, she destroys Poland. So the great players of early modern Ukraine, Poland, Crimean Tatars, and the Cossacks, all destroyed by Catherine and brought into the Russian Empire. A lot of people consider Russian absolutism as some kind of inheritance of the Mongol tradition, Asian despotism, or something like that. And this is an idea I'm going to develop later on. Hold your horses, not now in this episode where I'm just brushing over things, but writing essays. This was a European idea used by a Europeanizing from Europe. She was a German. But this is all happening on the eastern side of the Dnipro River for starters. And until the destruction of Poland, half of Ukraine is still in Poland. So what's going on with that? And it's the same thing, basically. In 1699, the rights of the Cossacks of a class are abolished. And just as the Cossacks had to rise up as a replacement for the old Rus nobility, what had to replace the Cossacks? Basically bandits, the oporishki. And in a lot of the Ukrainian imagination, these are still just Cossacks. These peasant rebels rising up against the Polish landlords, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor. Dovbush is the Ukrainian Robin Hood. So there's all these raids and more revolts, and this Polish state itself is getting weaker and weaker. The Polish nobility take more and more for themselves. The Russians, especially under Catherine, are buying Polish nobles to the point where in the last century of the existence of the Polish Commonwealth, it's all essentially just a Russian puppet state. And it's something that the Polish nobles themselves very much notice, leading to the creation of the Bar Confederacy. The Russians force the Poles to accept Orthodox Christianity. This makes the Polish nobles very angry, leading to this Bar Confederacy uprising, who try to take back their country from Russia. And at the same exact time as the Bar Confederacy, in the year 1768, there's also the Kolivshchina, which is one of a series of revolt by Haidamaks. Again, just another word for basically bandits. This is another massacre of Jews, and if you've heard me talk about Uman, that's why that's important. I'll just leave that in as a note for future history talks, perhaps. But we have both Polish nobles and Ukrainians having all these uprisings, Poland as a state growing weaker, bought out, controlled by these ruling oligarchs who are controlled by Russia, and I have some theses about that for the modern world, who jealously guard their individual rights as their country collapses, their rights as a privileged class as the country falls apart around them, which leads to the partitions of Poland. Russia no longer sees much point in keeping Poland around anymore, and instead of having a war over who will conquer Poland, they make a little arrangement. Russia, Austria, and Prussia, the German state of Prussia, agree to partition Poland between themselves in a series of 3 partitions that last between 1772 and 1795, at the end of which there is no more Poland. So at the end, we have our new status quo, which is that the Ukrainian lands are now divided between the Russian Empire to the east and Austria in the west. So here we are at the 19th century, or the long 19th century, as some historians call it. From the Napoleonic Wars until World War I. Napoleon did not go through Ukraine, but as the war over Napoleon and his conquests come to an end, there's a new important force in Europe, and that's ideology, nationalism. The sense that a country is not its nobility and who they rule over, but rather everyone within that country. There's the idea of liberalism, of capitalism, of the early forms of industrialism. All these are now acting on the Ukrainian lands. Before we get into some of those details, though, let's get into where everyone is. So those Cossacks, who I said had lost out in Poltava and all those wars, and until Catherine destroys the Cossacks, tears down their fortifications, abolishes them as a military. This led to a period of them trying to find their fate in the Ottoman Empire and all that, but eventually the Cossacks are invited back into the empire as just a military unit that is used to push southwards into the lands of the Caucasus Mountains. And a lot of Ukrainian Cossacks end up in what is now the Kuban region of Russia, pushing out the Circassians and other Caucasian peoples into the mountains, and leading to a lot of the Kuban region become populated by ethnic Ukrainians, these descendants of the Cossacks, something which would last until the Soviet era, where they would be starved and Russified. But even now, the local Russian has a bit of a Ukrainian to it. Catherine also takes this territory of southern Ukraine in particular and wants to settle and industrialize it. So throughout many of these centuries, because of all these constant wars that are going on, constant raids, it's not a densely populated area. Like I said, that there is a culture there, there are people there, but most people tend to live north towards Kyiv more so than south towards the Black Sea. Catherine wants to change that. And so at the tail end of the 1700s, we get the foundations of the modern cities of Odessa, Kherson, Mykolaiv, throughout Crimea. A lot of the cities of southern Ukraine are founded in this time, but put an asterisk next to that because there had already been cities in most of these locations, or some kind of settlement in most of these locations, but they were expanded as larger cities. This is a touchy subject to say that Odessa was founded by Catherine because there had already been cities there. There had already been Cossack encampments nearby. There had already been a town populated by Turks, a town populated by Moldovans, Romanians. So they didn't spring up out of the ground from nothing, but that's one way to understand the origins of these modern cities. Look at Donbass. We have later on John Hughes, a Welsh industrialist, founding the city of Donetsk, though again, older Cossack encampments were nearby. And with Ukraine being at the front lines of a lot of these wars in the past, they no longer were. The front lines of the wars between the Turks and the Russians were now shifted towards what's now Romania and the Balkans. They're shifted south towards the Caucasus Mountains, east into Central Asia. But throughout the 19th century, there are not too many wars in Ukraine itself, other than the Crimean War, leading to a lot of developments of the people there. And like I said, the 19th century is the age of ideology, and not just amongst Ukrainians or Poles or Russians, or it happened amongst everyone. On one hand, the Poles living under Russian, German, Austrian occupation after having for several centuries been a ruling class that was very wealthy, very cultured, very educated, now being subservient. There was a series of revolutions that rose up Polish national consciousness, and this is not a Polish history thing, but There was the November Revolution, where they sought to reestablish the independence of Poland. That led to them being crushed because the ideology of Polishness then had to be destroyed by the Russians because they saw Polishness as a threat. So the Russians were trying to create a Russianness. A lot of the nobility spoke French. They saw themselves as a kind of transnational nobility. They weren't related to the dirt peasants. They were related to the German nobility. They spoke French. They read French. They married German princesses. They weren't really connected to a Russian and didn't want the stupid peasants to have such delusions as to thinking that they were the same thing. The 19th century that began to change. The idea of a Russian nationality had to be formed. A Russian national identity based on the three pillars of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality. And in that last point, nationality, they had to Russify a lot of the peoples they conquered, including the Poles, including the Ukrainians, including the Jews. They had to be brought into the Russian national idea. Meanwhile, Austria was now in charge of a very large empire, very diverse empire, made up of all kinds of people, Hungarians, Croatians, Czechs, and Ukrainians, Poles. And to answer that question, they had to create a kind of federative system where different nationalities had different rights within the empire, still governed by a German ruling class. But they, as political parties begin to be formed throughout the 19th century, as modern politics as we can think of it pop up, these are largely along national lines, and they have to interact with each other in that way. And where in Russia, the Ukrainian language faces a series of bannings and restrictions, Austria kind of allows it to happen, meaning that a lot of the Ukrainian culture, language, printing happens more so in the western part of the country than the eastern part. Same thing with the Yiddish language, by the way. There's heavy restrictions on the Yiddish language used by Jews that are less in the west of Ukraine, turning Galicia into what's called a kind of space of competing nationalisms. You have all these groups forming nationalities right next to each other, leading to a lot of conflicts in the future, but very fascinating. Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, Armenians, everybody claiming Galicia as a root of who they are. And a part of what makes a nation at this time is language. So before, if you're a literate person, you are writing in Latin, you're writing in French, languages of high culture. Now, you have to look towards your native language to write in, because your language is what makes you a nation. So at the tail end of the 1700s, Kotlярevsky wrote Aeneida, which is a Ukrainian telling of the Aeneid, the Roman story of the founding of Rome. He writes it in Ukrainian. It's the first Ukrainian book. And throughout the 19th century, the main figures of the Ukrainian national idea, and this is not unique to Ukraine, look to Ireland, for example, in a lot of countries, it's the writers, it's the poets, it's the people who use the language who create the nation. The biggest among them is Taras Shevchenko. Taras Shevchenko was born as a serf, but as he grows older, serfdom's abolished eventually, but he joins what's called the Brotherhood of Cyril and Methodius, an underground organization that pressures towards Ukrainian national autonomy. And Taras Shevchenko, along with other writers, Ivan Franko, Lesya Ukrenka, create a Ukrainian literary culture that is used to basically show that we are a people with our own language, our own culture, our own things to be proud of. And this is something that everyone is doing throughout the world. Even if you look at America, Webster's Dictionary is a way of saying that this is our American language that's different from that of England, which means we are a nation on our own. The other idea that comes in is socialism. Das Kapital is written in 1867. Socialism in its various forms begins to spread throughout Europe, and many people who believe in the Ukrainian national idea are themselves socialists, such as Ivan Franko. And throughout all of this, of course, Russia sees itself as the guardian of the old order, and therefore its responsibility to crush liberal and left-wing revolts throughout Europe. They call themselves the gendarme of Europe. I talked about this before in my anti-Semitism episode. Another thing that idea for future episode here, this idea of the gendarme of Europe, but just keep in mind that Russia positioned itself as counter to these newfangled ideas of equality and all that, and wanted to help any European monarch put down rebellions, which was a big thing in the springtime of nations of 1848, where people influenced by all these ideologies I've been talking about think that now is their time to create modern liberal states, which the ruling monarchs did not like that idea very much and called in Russia to help crush many of these rebellions, such as in Hungary. And the last factor here is industrialization. In the 19th century, we get all these industrial inventions that begin in the United States and Great Britain, spread throughout Western Europe, but was also hitting Ukraine at this time. Not as much. It was slower. The various social conditions in Russia made it difficult, though they were building at the time. But that led to the growth of the cities, led to urbanization, more and more people moving into the cities, which meant more contact with these ideologies that you don't meet as much when you're living on the farm. And you get modern commerce. Kyiv gets wealthier from actually the sugar beet industry. In Ukraine, they were growing a lot of sugar beets, and then those sugar beets were then rendered down into white grain sugar and sold to make things tasty. Big part of the economic growth of Kyiv in this area. But this long 19th century had to come to an end, and it ended in 1914, World War I. The forces of Germany, Austria, and Turkey against Britain, France, and Russia, and Ukraine was one of those front lines. And Ukrainians fought in both the armies of Austria and the armies of Russia. In Austria, there was a unit called the Sich Riflemen. The Sich Riflemen were raised on these ideas of Ukrainian statehood. They were a Ukrainian unit. And in the years after World War I, the veterans of the Sich Riflemen would go on to fill very important roles in the development of an independent Ukraine. And of course, it meant that Ukraine was the front line. Many battles were fought throughout the central part of Ukraine, where Austria met Russia. And when Russian troops entered into Austrian Galicia, they ravaged the place pretty bad. It was one of the early uses of things like the Red Cross, although the Red Cross itself came out of the 19th century, including the problems posed by the Crimean War. But if you look back into the headlines from the Russian conquest of Galicia, it reads a lot like you would read modern war coverage today, tales of people starving, dying, all that, and pleading for fundraising to help these people who are going through something horrible and get them out of there. But Ukraine's time in this war ends in 1917 and 1918. In 1917, we get the February Revolution, where the Russian Tsar is overthrown by a coalition of mostly liberal and left forces. And in this in-between period, Ukraine's still at war. They have not surrendered yet. They're still a part of a Russia. This is now called the Provisional Government. But the Ukrainian national idea takes the form of the Central Rada, the Central Parliament, where the idea is that Ukraine will be a autonomous region within a larger Russian empire, but a Russian empire that is democratic, liberal, constitutionalist. And the leading figure of this Central Rada was Hrushevsky. Hrushevsky was a historian by trade. So the founder of the modern Ukrainian state, in a way, was a historian. That's kind of cool. This situation lasts until the October Revolution of that year, where the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government in Russia, and early in 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where they pull out of the war in exchange for Germany occupying Ukraine. And this is where the Central Rada gives way to something called the Hetmanate. Hetmanate ruled by Hetman Skoropadsky, who is more of a conservative figure who wants Ukraine to be a monarchy like Germany is at the time. However, 1918 is not a good year to begin being a German ally because the war ends that November. And with World War I ending in November, so falls the Hetmanate of Skoropadsky and is replaced by the Directorate of Petlura, Simon Petlura. And while this is all recognized now as being the first Ukrainian state, it was very much a civil war. The Bolshevik army was going through Ukraine. I'm not covering World War I in Ukraine would be the most frustrating thing in the world. Things changed on a week-by-week basis. You had multiple armies going through at any given time. You had the Bolshevik Red Army. You had the White Army, which was the old government, a lot of monarchists, complicated. The former pre-revolutionary Russia was a lot of what the White Army was. You had the Black Army of Makhno, anarchists who operated in the southeast of Ukraine, around the regions of Zaporizhia especially. You had both the West and East Ukrainian People's Republics, which were merged together into the Ukrainian People's Republic that Baturil was the head of. You had the Polish army coming in. The Poles wanted Lviv. They did not want a West Ukrainian People's Republic to exist. They wanted all of Western Ukraine again for themselves. Though the alliance they had to strike with Ukrainians to fight against the Russians, complicated. Endgame, the Bolsheviks win. The Bolsheviks conquer the eastern parts of the Ukrainian territories, forming the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Poland takes the west, and so we have Ukraine split once again between what's called the Second Polish Republic and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. We are now in the Soviet era, and the early Soviet era actually tends to be kind of okay for Ukrainians. There's something called the Silver Age. This is a blooming of Ukrainian culture. At first, the Soviet Union decides to have a nationalities policy that allows different people to govern themselves, have their own language, have their own culture, as long as they're commonly part of the Soviet Union. So in the 1920s, there's a lot of writers, a lot of people who think that this whole Soviet Union thing will allow Ukraine to develop in its own way, just part of the Ukrainian working class. Though, of course, there's lots of executions and such during this time. It's not peachy, but that's kind of the idea of it in the broad strokes. Stalin had different ideas, however. Joseph Stalin comes to power, and it is a gradual consolidation. But in the 1930s, really decides that this whole autonomy business is not for him. And so this generation of writers, of artists that pop up in the 90s and early 30s are destroyed in what's called the Executed Renaissance. The first executions of this Executed Renaissance take place in 1930, but would stretch throughout the 1930s into the Great Terror of 1937. Meanwhile, there's collectivization. Now, one issue that Ukraine had with joining communist Soviet Union was that the traditional mode of land ownership in Ukraine favored smallholders, small farmers, often a part of bigger plantations, but it was your responsibility to farm your own stuff. And so the Soviets turned these smaller farms into larger kolkhoz, collective farms, something that was resisted. And also the Soviets remembered that in the creation of the Soviet Union, the most troublesome people within it were the Ukrainians. There were plenty of other wars. There were plenty of other conflicts with the other constituent peoples of the USSR, but the Ukrainians were the largest. They were the most important to Russia because, as the old saying goes, with Ukraine, Russia has an empire. Without Ukraine, Russia doesn't. Something had to be done about Ukraine. And so in 1933 to 1934, we have the Holodomor, death by starving, a famine that kills about 4 to 5 million people. You'll see some arguments about whether this qualifies as a genocide or not. However, keep in mind that the person who kind of invented the idea of genocide as a legal category was Raphael Lemkin, who studied in Lviv. And he used that as well as the Armenian genocide as his two examples. Here's my argument for why it's a genocide. When it comes time to try and survive a famine, what you do is go somewhere else where there's food. That's how you survive. There's no such thing as a global famine yet, but there are localized famines. Some places hit worse than others. So if there's a problem where you are, go somewhere where that problem doesn't exist. The Soviets didn't let Ukrainians do that. They sealed the borders. They did not let people leave Ukraine. And often they did not even allow people to leave their town. You had an internal passport that said you were allowed to leave your collective farm. If you did not get the permission of your boss, you could not go anywhere. And so they're left to starve. Meanwhile, food continued to be exported from Ukraine. The Soviets sold Ukrainian grain on the global market in order to fund Soviet industrialization. They took food out of the hands of starving people to sell it. That's deliberate. That's genocide. Then comes 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany agreed to split Eastern Europe between themselves. The Soviet Union takes what was then Eastern Poland And the way they justified it was that they were unifying West Ukraine with the rest of Ukraine. This was national liberation for the Ukrainian people from the Poles. However, like in the past, it turned out that rule by the Poles was not as bad as rule by the Russians. This, with the exception of Crimea, is basically what Ukraine's modern borders look like. But with the incorporation of the Polish territories, there is a mass killing of Poles throughout Ukraine. The Poles were, at this point, were still a large number of people in places like Kyiv or Kharkiv. A lot of them were killed. And the extension of collectivization into Galicia. But what's happening in Poland before this point? In interwar Poland, they control a large part of Ukraine, the Galicia and Volhynia regions in the west. And at first, the Polish government under Pilsudski, kind of the dictator at the time, understands that they have to balance out the interests of the different people who make up Poland. It's a very diverse country at this point, between Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Jews, and they have to kind of sort out those differences in order to have a functioning state. So the Ukrainians do get some leeway at this time. But he is later replaced by a much more right-wing nationalist government who sees it as much more important to extend Polish culture, Polish people into the Ukrainian lands, which means suppressing Ukrainian culture, colonizing Ukrainian areas. And they did use the term colonization for this. So in interwar Poland, there then becomes this Ukrainian resistance movement. Some people choose peaceful methods, choose diplomacy, choose politics to work within the system to secure Ukrainian rights. Other people choose violence. Most famously, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and Stepan Bandera. Stepan Bandera, who would later go on to see the Nazis as his potential ally in securing Ukrainian independence. And without getting into all that argument, yes, they did take part in the killing of Jews and Poles. But also Poles killed, like, oh my, so much. Not this episode. Moving on, World War II, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Peace treaty between the Nazis and the Soviets ends in 1941. Operation Barbarossa moves in and swiftly conquers most of Ukraine. Kyiv is taken within just a couple of months. War starts in the summer. Kyiv is taken in the fall. And almost as soon as Kyiv is taken, the Babyn Yar massacre happens, where the Germans slaughter most of the Jewish population of Kyiv and its surrounding areas. They move further east. This isn't a World War II podcast. You've heard the story of World War II plenty of times. Moving on. But during the occupation of Ukraine by the Nazis, one of the major factions then becomes the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the core of which, yes, made up of people who had initially allied with the Germans. However, when the Germans announced that they would not allow a Ukrainian state to be formed and arrested the people trying to form it, there was a split in the Ukrainian nationalist movement, many of whom went on to fight against the Nazis. And as World War II comes to a close in 1945, this partisan movement continues into Soviet rule. UPA, as it's called, resistance, continues throughout the 1950s, with the last holdout being taken over by the Soviets in 1960. So as late as 1960, there was still this Ukrainian nationalist partisan resistance happening, particularly in the west of Ukraine. But also with the end of World War II, Ukraine becomes a founding member of the UN. Ukraine did have its own seat at the UN. Ukraine and Belarus were also sitting members of the United Nations, not just as the Soviet Union, but with their own seats. Stalin dies in 1953, beginning some of the reform processes under Khrushchev coming from Ukraine, actually. And Crimea is joined in with Ukraine at this time. The Russians will call this Khrushchev's gift. That's nonsense. Historically, Crimea was always attached to Ukraine. It was even a part of the same province under the Russian Empire. During the Civil War period after World War I, the Crimean Tatars tried to join the Ukrainian National Republic, though it did not work because they're killed by the Bolsheviks. And just physically, Crimea is a part of Ukraine. This was a decision that was done in large part because the Russian Republic could not really supply things to Crimea very easily. a problem which showed up again after the Russian annexation in 2014. Surprise, surprise, there was a lot of good reasons why Crimea was Ukrainian that they then complained about once it became illegally annexed by Russia. But anyway. And during this period, Ukraine is part of Soviet history. They do not have a tremendous amount of autonomy to make their own decisions at this point. There is a common Soviet education system. There is a common Soviet state-prescribed culture. And so a lot of older Ukrainians will have similar cultural memories of this time as anyone else who grew up in the Soviet Union. Though, of course, plenty of local differences as well. And there were times under the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic when the leaders of that republic were more accepting of ideas of autonomy, of Ukrainian self-identity. One of these times was the early 60s, where there was a movement called the 60 Years, where they had enough freedom to create art, mostly artists, in the name of the common, human condition. These are great artists who did have Ukrainian ideas, but not just. They were, broadly speaking, think of them as the Ukrainian hippies, complete with the substance abuse of the hippies, but a beautiful moment in history. There's a 6 Years museum in Kyiv. If you happen to be here, go to it. 1976, there was the creation of the Ukrainian Helsinki Group, where they're supposed to monitor human rights in the Soviet Union. One of the first truly organized opposition liberal movements within the Soviet Union. Allowed to exist for 1 year. Most of them were arrested the next year. And the 6 years, a lot of them were arrested in a crackdown on the freedom that might have existed in the 60s. That was destroyed. This time, largely done using more individual methods. They would often use psychological conditioning or psychological stigma. They would say that, and basically, if you oppose the Soviet Union, they're definitionally crazy, so off to the asylum with you. One of the great of these 60 years was Vasil Stus. It was just recently the anniversary of his death. Great poet of the 1960s, great poet of the 60 years, was arrested, sent to the Gulag until he died in 1985. And as we talked about, when we talked about Medvedchuk, the Ukrainian oligarch Medvedchuk, Putin's man in Ukraine, that is where Medvedchuk's career started, getting Vasil Stus thrown into the Gulag as his defense attorney. That's how the Soviet Union worked. 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This is a war that the Soviet Union turned out not to be ready for. They were there throughout the 1980s. The cost and just people not wanting to go and die in Afghanistan was one of the major contributors to the eventual destruction of the Soviet Union. The Chernobyl disaster, 1986. You probably know what that is by now. Massive nuclear power plant to the north of Kyiv has a nuclear meltdown. Watch the Chernobyl miniseries on HBO to get a better feel of that. But again, that reinforced the idea that the Soviet government could not help you, leading to people not caring to keep it going. But then also the 1980s was the era of perestroika, the opening up of the country. Different opposition groups were allowed again. There were less control over art, and at the same time, friendlier relations with the West and the United States. But one thing that perestroika allowed for was for all these smaller national movements who had been underground for most of the Soviet Union to get a bit more oxygen to them. And when people realized that they were allowed to do this without being thrown in the gulag and murdered, more people thought it was a good idea. So in 1990, we see the beginning of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the creation of independent Ukraine. We have a human chain from Lviv to Kharkiv showing the unity of the country on the occasion of the unification of the East and West Ukrainian republics in 1919. We have the revolution on granite, the first of the Maidan revolutions, until we hit the proclamation of state sovereignty in 1991. A series of referenda on how much independence Ukraine would have. Initially, the idea, like with after World War I, was to have a autonomous Ukraine within a reformed Soviet Union. But after the hardliner coup in Moscow, that turned out not to be such a great idea, and independence was the preferred option. And then they had the Act of Proclamation of State Independence, August 24th, 1991. There is now independent and unified Ukraine, leading into the 90s. For the 90s, I'll run us through by president. I think that's a good way to break it down. The first president of Ukraine after independence, Leonid Kravchuk. For him, he had to do state building. He inherited a lot of Soviet institutions. They now had to be Ukrainian institutions. Though truth be told, there wasn't much difference between them. Even now, there's a little bit of, But at the time, basically nothing. Also, a lot of economic problems. The economy collapsed. The GDP of Ukraine halved after independence. Part of the reason for this was that it was the collapse of the Soviet economic system, the supply chains, all that. But a lot of it is just that the Soviet economy was a lie, and only now was it actually being recorded truthfully. So economics is fake a lot of the time. In this case, the transition from things being fake to being real lost a lot of people, a lot of money, a lot of poverty, a lot of problems. So his presidency, Kravchuk's, is a contentious one for that reason, though no one had a popular presidency, really. And in 1994, he signs the Budapest Memorandum. This is a word that's thrown around a lot. It is the agreement that Ukraine made that we would give up their nuclear capabilities in exchange. Russia and the United States would guarantee that Ukraine's borders would be inviolate, would be secure, in some way defended, though as a document did not have great guarantees to it, which is hopefully a lesson that we have learned by now. 1994 to 2005, the only Ukrainian president to serve 2 terms, Leonid Kuchma, saw the consolidation of a new system of oligarchic power. We have talked about this in our oligarch episodes. This was when politics in the country was melded between a series of oligarchic clans, a series of rich millionaires who grouped themselves together in alliances and then competed against each other for political power. However, within this Kuchma system, which most politicians in Ukraine grew out of, there were some reformers, namely Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko, who came to represent a more Western-looking, more reformist group within the country at the time. And it was also during this period of time where the modern Ukrainian liberal movement really gets its go. Liberal, national kind of movement gets its go. And that's with the Ukraine Without Kuchma movement. A lot of people who would later become important civil society figures got their start during the Ukraine Without Kuchma protests. And these were sparked by a series of events that, mostly assassinations, I'll talk about here. And that's one, the death of Vyacheslav Chornovil in 1999. He had a mysterious car crash. He was one of the leaders of the patriotic liberal movement in the 90s. And the next was the assassination of Georgy Gangadze in 2000, with the later what's called the cassette scandal, showing that it was Kuchma's inner circle, including his interior minister, the son of said interior minister, very deeply involved with Trump and all that, Giuliani. When he came in, all things are connected, and this protest movement was successful enough to derail a lot of Kuchma's attempts to centralize the country. He wanted to turn a lot of the country's power into just being around the president. This is at the same time the rise of Vladimir Putin, by the way. So the idea was in the air, this centralization of power. But in Ukraine, unlike Russia, there was a protest movement that derailed it. Ukraine Without Kuchma was successful in preventing a lot of the more autocratic inclinations of Kuchma. And this protest movement then led into our next event here, 2005, the Orange Revolution. Kuchma tried to set up Viktor Yanukovych as his successor and rigged the election for him to win. However, that was caught, leading to the Orange Revolution that called for a new, clean election, which led to the winning of Viktor Yushchenko, again, one of these reformers. The government under Viktor Yushchenko then went on to pass a bunch of pro-Western policies, recovered Ukraine's economy. So for the first time since independence, Ukraine had a GDP that was higher than under the Soviet Union. And in this time period between 2005 2010, this was Ukraine's westward attempts. Though a lot of it came apart, one, because of conflicts with Tymoshenko, his ally, and two, the global financial crisis. And this is where history becomes a bit too recent, because I'm now talking about a history podcast about the thing that happened while I was in university and led to everyone I knew in university having trouble getting jobs afterwards. But because this did not turn out well, this led to Viktor Yanukovych, the guy who was booted in the Orange Revolution, winning the presidential elections in 2010. Under Viktor Yanukovych, he tried to continue Kuchma's attempts of centralizing power. He was extremely authoritarian, extremely corrupt. There were a bunch of journalists and such who were either beaten or killed under his rule. Even before the revolution, he was making promises that he would continue the westward direction of the country. He promised to continue with the EU association, convincing people that he was safe enough. He had an image of the Russian gangster, but he was cleaned up by Trump's future campaign manager and made all the right sounds that he would continue westwardization. But eventually, that turned out not to be true. Canceled the European Association Agreement against his own promises, beginning the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity. 2013, the beginning of Euromaidan, lasting through February of 2014. Mass protests on the streets, mass state violence. Over 100 people are killed by the security services until Viktor Yanukovych is forced to flee the country, abandoning his position as president, leading to his impeachment and removal from office, and a new government set on European integration and the ideas of Maidan. Later, the election of Petro Poroshenko. Following Maidan is what is called the Russian Spring protests, where Russian agents tried to drum up protests in a lot of the cities of southern and eastern Ukraine. Most of them fall flat completely. Odessa is slightly larger. There's clashes in Odessa, which lead to the trade unions fire, which was actually set by the pro-Russian protesters, who were really mostly just gangsters themselves. That's a big topic. Whatever, moving on. And then eventually the beginning of the war. The protests turned out to not lead anywhere until the arrival of Ihor Gurkin in Slovyansk with a militia made up of mostly neo-Nazis and whatever gangsters he can scrape together, along with some riot police who left Kiev figuring that there might be some revenge for all the murders that they did, though there never actually was, creating the Donetsk People's Republic at the same time as the Luhansk People's Republic. So yes, this uprising, what they tried to look like local uprisings, failed, so Russia again just sent in a group of militants. This was the Donbass War. Initially, Ukraine did not have much of an answer for it, leading to reliance on volunteer units formed up of Maidan protesters, though the country did mobilize fairly quickly. Slovyansk was taken in April, though the battle there was eventually lost. In July of 2015, there's the downing of MH17, an aircraft mostly filled with Dutch people, was shot down by the Russians under the command of Ihor Gurkin. But by September, Ukraine was basically winning. This militia was not enough to do the job, which led to the Battle of Ilovaisk. Ukraine tries to control more of the state border between itself and Russia, but as it does so, the Russian army actually crosses the border. Regular units of the Russian army cross the border, trap them at Ilovaisk, and it's a major defeat, leading eventually to the signing of the first Minsk Agreement. The first Minsk Agreement does not hold because Russia insists on still attacking Donetsk airport until February of 2015, Minsk II, the end of the hot phase of the Donbass War, and the beginning of the cold phase from 2015 to 2022. From 2015 to 2022, Ukraine embarks on a reformist mission, trying to make the country better, reduce corruption, improve the military, digitize the bureaucracy, things that are hard to talk about as history because of the things I'm here for. There is association with Europe. There is a visa-free travel scheme with Europe. The country is moving closer to forms of Euro integration, though EU membership and NATO membership are still far, far afield in the future. Then 2022. Throughout 2021, there is a buildup of the Russian military on the borders with Ukraine, which many fear is setting the stage for an invasion, while others say is just exercises trying to look intimidating. February 24th, 2022, the full-scale invasion takes place, and here we are, the Russo-Ukraine War, fought on the southern steppe more so than anywhere else by a Russian empire that wants to take back what it feels like it once lost, by Ukrainians who, in the spirit of the Cossacks, have that desire for independence and freedom that Russia certainly does not. What the future will be is not yet written, but that was all a version of the past. I will attempt to expand upon these further in the coming year, but until that time, if you'd like to support me in those endeavors, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. Please tell your friends and family about us, that the more eyes, the better the algorithm, the better we do. If you'd like to support Ukraine more broadly, please go to our link tree for a list of projects and charities that you can support. And thank you very much to our subscribers. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Elizabeth Hughes, James Burke, Jan Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Megan, Michael Wickman, PLM, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Abel Lenz, Ada McDonald, Alex Strochmal, Anastasia, Andrew Glenn, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, Dan, David Wall, Demetrio, Dish Taco, Emily Bavona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Hoem, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jared, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Lord De Leon, Lori Halila, Lemonikin, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Caselco, Anonymous, Noah Brown, Noam Hart, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Gangris, Scott Torkyuk, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Ursula Zolenkoff, Veronica, William Brown, Zay Perry, and Marcus Nashkus. Thank you all very much for your support. Next episode, episode 100, will be our New Year episode. Me and Romeo will talk about what happened in the last year, what may happen in the next year. But until next week, thank you much for listening. History is important. Happy New Year. Slava Ukraini.